Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the Serapis explodes in high spirits?
Here we are. Enjoy!
The shout rang across the water defiantly, sticking in the memories of all who heard it. Indeed, it would cement the fight in history. Captain Pearson of the Serapis, seeing how superior his firepower was and the terrible damage his guns were inflicting on the enemy ship, called to ask if they were going to strike their colors. "I have not yet begun to fight," shouted back John Paul Jones. He had more men. His ship, the Bonhomme Richard, was a larger ship, and if nothing else, he and his men were tenacious. America did not have much chance of winning a sea war against the English, but that did not mean they could not win individual battles. If nothing else, John Paul Jones was going to try. The Bonhomme Richard had lost several cannons early in the fight. They were old, and on being fired, some of them exploded. Now, the men under John Paul Jones were counting on small arms and grenades. The two ships had been lashed together as both sides attempted to board the other and were repelled. Finally, a sailor of the Bonhomme Richard climbed to the end of a yardarm with a bucket of grenades and took aim. The cartridges for the cannons on board the Serapis had been laid out in readiness, and a well-placed grenade was all it took to start a chain reaction that caused carnage on the deck of the English ship. The Serapis, no longer in any condition to continue the fight, surrendered. The cost of the battle was a high one. On both sides, almost a full half of the sailors and soldiers were dead or wounded. The Serapis needed a new mast after the grenade bombardment it had suffered, but it proved to still be in better condition than the Bonhomme Richard. During the fight, the Alliance, one of the other ships of the American fleet, took it upon itself to fire on the two ships indiscriminately. With the Bonhomme Richard and the Serapis tied together as they were, the shots from the Alliance had damaged both ships badly, but it was possible that the Bonhomme Richard had actually suffered the worst of it. Though John Paul Jones and his men fought hard to keep her afloat, after 2 days, it became clear that the Bonhomme Richard was past saving. From on board the Serapis, John Paul Jones wrote to Benjamin Franklin to inform him that the ship that had been named in his honor had sunk, and that he had been forced to transfer his men and his command to the captured ship. They were able to rig a temporary mast for the Serapis, but she was in bad need of repairs. His men needed to recover, and something needed to be done with the prisoners they now had. John Paul Jones wrote to Benjamin Franklin that his intention was to sail for Amsterdam in hopes of finding there either instructions from Franklin about what he was to do next, or at least a French ambassador he could get guidance from. If John Paul Jones had thought the Dutch would welcome him, he was to be disappointed. On finding his way to the harbor of Texel, John Paul Jones found himself at the center of a diplomatic incident. The Dutch did not recognize America as an independent nation, and therefore what John Paul Jones had done was officially an act of piracy in their eyes. They demanded that John Paul Jones free both his prisoners and the Serapis. John Paul Jones had not intended to hold on to his prisoners. His plan from the start was to trade them to redeem prisoners who had been taken by the British. The Serapis was a different matter, however. She was quite the prize, and John Paul Jones had no interest in seeing her back in British hands. Though she was in rough shape now, the Serapis was quite the prize if refitted. She was a brand new ship. John Paul Jones had captured her on her very first mission for the British Navy. The 880-ton, 2-deck Roebuck-class fifth-rate ship was strong enough to cause trouble for the weak American Navy if returned to the British, and John Paul Jones would be left without his prize. A solution presented itself when it was recalled the nature of the Bonhomme Richard. Though she had been under the command of John Paul Jones, and had been considered an American vessel by those who recognized America as an independent nation, she had originally been a French ship. John Paul Jones had given her a French name out of recognition of this, trying to please both Benjamin Franklin and the French admiral with a single gesture. Now, with Benjamin Franklin's consent, a French flag was hoisted on the Serapis. While the Dutch might not formally recognize the American government, they certainly did recognize the nation of France. With France and England at war, and by designating the Serapis as a French capture by the French ship, the Bonhomme Richard, there was no more problems that the Dutch would raise about her capture. This also extended to all of the other ships in John Paul Jones' fleet, leaving him with only the Alliance, an American-built ship, in his command, and with no French subjects any longer part of his crew. The French were not prepared to start a diplomatic incident with the Dutch, and they left John Paul Jones to find his own way. John Paul Jones did not respond without any spite. He stripped everything useful from the Serapis to put onto the Alliance, which was badly in need of supplies. John Paul Jones did not think highly of Landais, the person who had been in command of the Alliance before he had been forced to transfer her, and he held him partially responsible for the sinking of the Bonhomme Richard. It is hard to tell how much of his description of the Alliance is a result of his rage against Landais, and his desire to discredit him as a commander. But at least he had a fair portion of fresh British stores from the Serapis to bring her back into shape. The Serapis, now under the control of the French Navy, was sent to Lorient, France, where she underwent a complete refit. She might be a new ship, but the damage from the battle was so extensive that it would be some time before she would be able to be brought into fighting order again. It wasn't until 1781 that she was sent to the Indian Ocean under the command of Lieutenant Roche to protect French shipping from the British. The ship made a stop at the harbor of Sainte-Marie in Madagascar as a matter of business, and while Roche was on shore attending to this, business continued on board the ship as well. The first mate went down into the hold to dilute the spirits that were given to the sailors as their liquor ration. Leaning over the barrels of spirits, the mate grew frustrated with his inability to see properly with a lantern in his hand. Against strict orders, the mate set aside the lantern and removed the candle, holding it close to the barrel to see better. His orders had been given for a reason, however, and a piece of the burning wick falling into the barrel was all it took for a fire to start and quickly become more than the crew was able to control. Wooden ships were full of things that could burn in an instant, and fueled by the alcohol, it didn't matter how hard the men tried to quench the flames. Roche only knew of the disaster that had visited his command when a cannon went off from the Serapis to alert the harbor of the ship's plight. Though Roche quickly had himself rowed back to his command, there was nothing he could do. When it became clear that the ship was a lost cause, he ordered evacuation to the ship's boats, which had already been launched as a precaution. As the fire raged, it arrived at the ship's powder magazine, at which point the ship exploded. As is always the case when a ship is lost, Roche was forced to face a court-martial, though he was completely exonerated of any wrongdoing. He had been on shore conducting business for his ship, and he could be considered reasonable in his expectation that his men would follow the protocol of not removing candles from lanterns that were specially designed to prevent exactly what happened to the Serapis. The French did some minimal salvage efforts to try to recover the cannons, easily the most valuable parts of the wreck, and then she was quickly abandoned and forgotten about. The historical significance of the Serapis has led it to be of archaeological and historical interest to a modern audience, however. The significance of being the opponent to the Bonhomme Richard in one of the most famous Navy engagements of the American Revolution makes it a tempting target, but an elusive one. The very nature of the wreck makes identification difficult, and though a shipwreck that might have been the Serapis was found by a dive crew that was looking for it in 2008, its identity has not been confirmed. The Bonhomme Richard has proven to be equally hard to find, and just as sought after. The two ships that were once bound together in fierce combat and both sailed under the command of John Paul Jones now share the fate of being hard to find despite multiple efforts. For the first-hand accounts of the commands of John Paul Jones, please see the logs of the Serapis Alliance Ariel under the command of John Paul Jones, 1779 to 1780. And for more information about the Serapis and Bonhomme Richard, please see our sources in the description below. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.